Hello, this Dating the Old Testament video is on the book of Judges. Let me share my screen. Okay, the book of Judges. The picture there, you might guess, is Samson having a fight with a lion. The structure of the book of Judges is more complex than Joshua and more complex than most books of the Old Testament. I believe it falls into three main parts. Part one goes from Judges 1:1 through chapter 2, verse 5. Part two has its own prologue and goes from Judges 2:6 all the way through chapter 16. And it's this part of the book of Judges that has actual judges. And part three is Judges 17 through 21. The three parts are not sequential. They did not go in order um, inside each part they're in order, but the three don't go in order one with the other. Now, Judges 5 in the middle of part two is different from the rest of part two. In the other books we've looked at so far, I've put heavy emphasis on who the author was because that will usually tell you just when it was written. The Talmud says that Samuel wrote the book of Judges, and so that would be kind of the traditional position, and I usually give a fair amount of weight to that. But this is one case where I think I'm going to not do that. The book of Judges doesn't reflect Samuel's view of the way things were with judges and the way they're going to be when there are kings. Now, here's a timeline where I can illustrate what I was talking about when I said that they're not sequential. Part one starts there at the far left with the death of Joshua, and it goes for just a little bit of time. And then part two starts before the death of Joshua. Joshua is still alive, and it's rather late in his life. And part two goes for quite a long ways. And I put 410 years followed by a question mark because that may not actually be the right number. And we'll get to that in a minute. Part three goes back close to the beginning of the period of Judges, and it lasts for just a little while. So we're going to talk about part three first, because once you're finished with part three, you're finished with the book, and that tells us really when the book was written. The author of the third section was really responsible for pulling the entire book together. He arranges the first two sections in a way that address his main purpose. In part three, there aren't any actual judges. It consists of two stories, and they're both very, very grim and depressing narratives. The first one explains why the tribe of Dan is in the wrong place. If you read the book of Joshua, you saw where the tribes were allocated certain parts of the land that they were supposed to live in. And the tribe of Dan was allocated some land on the central and southern Mediterranean coast, but they don't end up there. They end up in the very far north part of Israel. So they're in the wrong place. And the first narrative tells why that happened. And then the second narrative tells why the tribe of Benjamin turns out to be a small tribe that's kind of an afterthought in size compared to Judah that it ends up along with. When they were giving census of the people in the wilderness, Benjamin's a pretty large tribe, but by the time you get to the time of Kings, it is a small tribe. This is kind of a theme and a conclusion for the book of Judges. And this is in the third part of the book of Judges, and it's put in there twice. It says, in those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. In other words, as long as there was no king, there was really no good law and order. People were uncontrolled. In fact, in the last part of the book of Judges, and nowhere else in the book, you have the phrase 7 times that says, in those days, and it says something that existed in those days. In all the cases where it says that, you can kind of contrast those days with this day, because the implication is this day is different. Like in 17:6, it says, in those days there was no king in Israel and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. That implies that this day, the day that the writer is writing, there is a king in Israel and there is law and order. 18:1 again says there's no king in Israel, and so this day there would be a king in Israel. 18:1 says, in those days the Dan tribe wasn't settled, but this day the Dan tribe is settled. 19:1 once again says no king in Israel. Chapter 20 verse 27 says, in those days the Ark of the Covenant was at Bethel. And so that means in this day, the Ark is somewhere else. So I believe that's going to be in Jerusalem as the somewhere else. In those days, Phinehas was the high priest. And so this day means that the high priest is someone else. Now, Phinehas was the grandson of Aaron, Aaron being high priest when they were leaving the land of Egypt. So Phinehas is only his grandson. And by this, you can tell that the accounts in this section of Judges are very early in the time period of the Judges. Even though this is toward the end of the book, it is not late chronologically. And then finally, the last verse in the book says, no king in Israel, everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Now, the time frame I think that we should address is because of this phrase. It says there was no king in Israel. It doesn't say Israel and Judah, like in the later divided kingdom time frame, which dominated much of the Old Testament. There was a kingdom of Israel and a kingdom of Judah, but there's not a hint of a division between Israel and Judah. There's plenty of divisions up different ways among the 12 tribes, but the binary division which dominated the rest of the Old Testament isn't really there in the book of Judges. So what it's telling you is that this book was written during the United Kingdom time frame, where Israel was a united kingdom. So that only gives us 3 kings it could possibly be. One would be Saul, he was the first king, followed by David, he was the second king, and then Solomon, he was the third king. Now, I don't think it could be Saul because there's too much conflict when Saul was king. And David, there was still really too much conflict while he was king. So it's only when you get to Solomon that you have a peaceful, settled, prosperous situation with strong central control and lots of law and order. And so I think that that is the time frame where you want to place the writing of the book of Judges. This is our time frame that we showed earlier. And now we're going to talk a little bit about part 2. Part 2 starts before the death of Joshua, and it has its own prologue and then a description of the 12 judges. For all the stories that it tells, they all include some gross or revolting element. If you have adolescent boys, they'll enjoy having those stories read to them because the gross things will be memorable. Even if the judge is good, like Ahud, the first one, or he wasn't the first one, but he's the first one with a real story, there will still be something gross in the story. And as the book goes on, the judges tend to get worse. For example, there's an earlier judge named Gideon who the tribe of Ephraim comes out and has a really sharp dispute with him. And Gideon answers with a pretty soft answer and satisfies them. But then a later judge, Jephthah, same thing happens. The tribe of Ephraim comes out and has an argument. It turns into a war and he has many of them killed. And then by the time you get to the last judge, Samson, he was not really much of a judge at all. He was just kind of a mighty man. And by that time, the Philistines are well entrenched. And that's significant because the Philistines are thought to have migrated to Canaan or Israel around 1190 BC. And so they don't really play a role in Joshua's campaigns earlier, probably because they just weren't there. But by the time you get to the last judge, Samson, not only are they there, but they're strong and even dominant in the southern part of the land of Israel. This is a table that lists the judges. In the far left column, you have the name of the foreign oppressor. The second column tells how many years the children of Israel were oppressed. The third column has the name of the judge. The fourth column has how many years the judge ruled. The fifth column has how many years the land rested, and the verses that give the numbers are in the sixth column. You might notice that for the first four judges, after the people were delivered, the land had rest in all those cases. All the last eight judges, it doesn't say anything about the land having rest. It just indicates that those guys ruled for a certain period of time. Now, if you add those years up, it comes out to a sum total of 410 years. Now, that seems to me like that's probably too many years for those to be sequential. I put a question mark because as a general rule of thumb, as I was writing my book and studying this thing, I was very confident about the dates after about 1000 BC. There was lots of reasons to believe that those dates would be highly accurate. But if you move back before 1000 BC, there were lots of reasons to really be kind of doubtful about the accuracy of the dates. So it could be that there's some other explanation and the 410 years is right. But as best as I could tell, it seems like that's too many years. If you went from Joshua to Samuel, according to the chronology that I've got, that would be about 316 years. So that's not enough years to fit in 410. So the suggestion that I have is that there was some overlap between the judges. Each judge didn't seem to rule the entire people of Israel, but only just a part of it. And so even when you get to the kings, there's some overlap in the times that they reigned. For example, David was a king, but before he died, he had Solomon crowned king. So they overlapped a little bit. Along with part 3, this second part of the book of Judges would have been written during the same time period, during Solomon's reign. The fact that the judges get worse and it shows a degenerating situation supports the author's main contention that the period of Judges was a dark period and the period of the kings was a better period. And so now we got to talk about the Song of Deborah. Judges 5 is the Song of Deborah and Barak. It is an old song. Now, it retells the victory over Jabin and Sisera that was in chapter 4. Chapter 4 is in prose, and chapter 5 is a song in poetry. Linguistically speaking, the Song of Deborah has the oldest Hebrew in the Bible, along with Exodus 15, Song of Moses, is also very old. And there are a few other ancient poems that also may be similarly old. But Judges 5 is a very long passage which has very, very old Hebrew. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's older than the old prose sections around it. When you're updating prose, I believe, as I discussed in the video on the work of the scribes, that the earlier scribes, the ones that worked in the first temple period, did some work to update the language as they went along. But when you come to a song, you cannot change the song without messing it up. And so even though the language is a little archaic, it's left in there. And so the language in Judges 5 is very, very old. So probably the date of writing or the date of the composition of the song is older than the rest of part 2. The rest of part 2, remember, I've got in the time frame of Solomon, which is a good many years after most of the judges lived. But Judges 5 is probably pretty close contemporary to the actual victory over Jabin and Sisera. And this song would, of course, been included by the final author. So that brings us to the first section. We're working backward to the book of Judges. The first section starts after the death of Joshua. That's what the first verse in the book says. And it describes some initial success that the people had in conquering the land. The book of Joshua really had described a series of military campaigns, but it had very little description of any settlement. The people always went back to their camp. But in the book of Judges, they're trying to settle the land. And initially they have some success. And then later there's kind of a long list of areas where they didn't have success, a long list of setbacks. And because of that, it's apparently because of their disobedience in certain areas. And so judgment is pronounced on the people by the angel of the Lord. When you get to the very next verse, chapter 2, verse 6, that's the part of the beginning of the second part of the book, and it has Joshua alive again. So that would indicate that that begins a different account. The downer ending of the first section of Judges matches the theme of the rest of the book, that the period of the Judges was a darker era than the updated time of the Kings. The first section doesn't get very far into the time of the Judges. There aren't any Philistines in there. There were just a lot of other Canaanite people. And the Dan tribe is not yet in the north. So the time frame just doesn't go very far from the beginning of the period after Joshua. And it reads a little bit like it's, once again, a little bit of an older account than the rest of the book. So the conclusion that I have for the book of Judges is that it was completed during the reign of Solomon. And that makes this the first time we've presented a book where most of the material was quite a bit older than the time that the author wrote it. And the final author included older texts, more or less intact. That would include the first part of the book of Judges was an older text, and the Song of Deborah was an older text. So that's the conclusion that I have for the book of Judges. I'll be back before too long with another video, and that will be on the book of Ruth, which took place during the book of Judges.